record that. Okay, so thanks everyone. So today we have Dr. Osei Appiah, who's a professor in the School of Communication at Ohio State University. He's a renowned communication and race scholar who has written and lectured about the impact of strategic communication messages and the role stereotypes play on intergroup interaction. His work attempts to provide a better understanding of the theoretical underpinnings and psychological mechanisms at work when people are exposed to ethnic-specific messages in the media. Dr. Appiah's recent line of research tackles rarely and inadequately addressed questions concerning the fears whites and blacks have regarding talking about race-specific issues with each other, and the important role political partisanship may play in this process. Osei, I'll let you take it away.
All right, I really appreciate it. First and foremost, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to speak about some of my research. I look forward to having a conversation with you tonight about my work. And forgive me if I don't have the computer science and engineering skills that many of you have. But my daughter does. She's graduating from high school and she plans to major in computer science next year. So I feel some connection with many of you who pursue that area. But I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind. I'm going to hopefully you're able to see my PowerPoint. Is that fine, Edward? All right, great. Thanks. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk to you today about this concept that I coined called cultural voyeurism, and basically how people respond to mainstream versus ethnic specific messages and how that impacts cultural voyeurism and race relations in many ways. So let me see if I can, here we go. So news coverage of events such as the Charlottesville protest and Black Lives Matter movement focuses on clashes between groups, and by doing so implies that racial conflict and division are rampant in the United States. If you look at much of the media coverage that we see these days, whether it's on television, social media, radio, print, it seems to paint a very bleak picture of race relations in society. And it's not surprising, especially when you look at the recent political climate that we're in. So one should feel maybe somewhat discouraged and not hopeful about the future of race relations and actually cross-group interaction. News media tend to favor stories that involve drama and will often use conflict between groups as a convenient and captivating way to cover issues. News coverage that focuses on cultural dispute and discord can hamper race and intergroup relations by highlighting intergroup differences and downplaying intergroup similarities. Images of racial and intergroup divides are contradicted by the fact that society is actually becoming increasingly progressive and accepting of diversity. And again, although we don't tend to see that, if we look at some of the various few examples that tend to provide us with a sense that maybe we should be encouraged and motivated about where we're going in the future. For example, if you look at Barack Obama's presidential election, both his first term and second term, he was overwhelmingly, well, maybe not overwhelmingly, but the majority of young whites voted for him in both elections. If we look at same-sex marriage, is now legal and supported by the majority of the country. If we look at the majority of folks in the US support transgender people using bathrooms that align with their identity. The killing of George Floyd by police has driven a national conversation about race in society. And if we look at past issues dealing with police brutality, there were a number of events across the country over the last several years where doctors and health professionals outside of hospitals would have these die-in protests where they would literally sit outside, as you can see here on the right-hand side, and lie down on the ground and hold these die-in protests against police brutality involving, and these events involved all racial groups. And then if you look at Black Lives Matter movement, the participants within Black Lives Matter, we may tend to think that the overwhelming majority of these folks are Black, but actually the Black Lives Matter movement, those folks who are participating in this movement are not just Black. As you can see from this picture here, in this picture at least, these are overwhelmingly non-Blacks who are helping to fight the cause dealing with Black Lives Matter. And here's another example of a very diverse group of folks who are supporting Black Lives Matter. So current communication research on race appropriately identifies and studies racial conflict, division, and miscommunication, but may overlook noteworthy progress in cross-racial communication and interaction. And I argue that new thinking is important to simultaneously leverage historical research on racial representation, acknowledge and expose evidence of racial discord, and properly recognize and explore progress toward positive change in race relations. And I don't think there's enough emphasis and discussion about the positive movement that we're doing in society dealing with race relations. And this leads to what I believe is a key indicator that shows the progress that we're making in society, particularly when we look at mediated intergroup interaction, which is facilitated by a term that I coined called cultural voyeurism. So today's presentation will focus on, in particular, young whites and how they respond to race-specific media and characters. And what we've seen with these young folks, particularly millennials, is that they're quite open-minded. And when they look at and evaluate cross-race groups, such as Blacks, we see that they're pretty indifferent when it comes down to evaluating Blacks vis-a-vis whites. And on many occasions, they actually have more favorable impressions of Blacks and Black culture than they do of mainstream white culture. They are often, if we think about white millennials and we see them as cultural voyeurs, what that demonstrates to us is that they show a great interest in, appreciation for, and desire to be part of Black culture. And as a result of cultural voyeurism and immersing oneself in a racial outgroup, you develop a better understanding of the cultural group, and it leads to empathy and perspective taking. And the research shows us, particularly research in social psych, it tells us that whites who engage in perspective taking show greater decreases in prejudice toward Blacks than those who do not. I'm gonna kind of take this home a little bit and show you how cultural voyeurism has actually worked in my own case. I talk about cultural voyeurism and in particular how whites might be cultural voyeurs, some whites might be cultural voyeurs as it pertains to Black culture. And I'm going to talk about how cultural voyeurism impacted me. So I was talking to Elizabeth and Edward a little earlier and talking about how I'm from Long Beach, California. I grew up in a Black inner city, poverty-stricken, gang-infested neighborhood in Long Beach, California. I pretty much sought to escape these daily stresses and fears and the mean streets of my neighborhood by aligning myself with the cultural phenomenon that would be fun, popular, and opposite of my own current lifestyle. And that took me to prep culture. I'm not sure how many of you guys are, you're probably very young, I suspect many of you, but I was very keen on prep culture. In high school, I became obsessed with immersing myself in prep culture. It was abundantly clear that I did not resemble the average prep. The prototypical prep was white, affluent, prep school educated, stylish. They tended to be, an affluent WASP who wore Ralph Lauren, Izod Lacoste, Sperry topsiders, penny loafers, J. Crew. One of the things that I tried to do to emulate them is I tried to wear the same thing, Ralph Lauren, Izod Lacoste. I played tennis. I tried golf. Frequently, I was frequently seen in my signature pink and lime green plaid shorts. I wore a pink polo shirt that I had flipped up, with the collar up, and I had tan topsiders that I would wear to try to emulate prep culture, to really immerse myself in the culture. I dreamed how it might be to go to a prestigious prep school, attend Ivy League college, summer in Martha's Vineyard. I desperately wanted to take part in this affluent white subculture and did whatever I could to learn and follow this lifestyle. So I became sort of a peeping Tom or voyeur into prep culture. But unlike the nefarious imagery that we might conjure up, associating the peeping Tom or voyeur looking in the window of a home of an unsuspecting person to derive some kind of gratification, I looked into the window of a television screen or a movie screen to observe and acquire as much information as I could about white prep culture. I watched television shows like we see here, Family Ties, and movies like 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, Dead Poet Society. I often walk through stores like J. Crew and Brooks Brothers, Williams-Sonoma, to dream about shopping there, to learn more about prep culture. I had a couple of Black friends who had the same fascination with prep culture. But when we ultimately, our fascination with and immersion into prep culture was short-lived, because eventually we realized we couldn't afford this lifestyle, and we would always be seen as an out-group member to white preppies and probably a weird outcast by members of the Black community. So this fascination that I had with wanting to be a prep could be described by cultural voyeurism. So this is a way of kind of explaining to you how I was a cultural voyeur. Now, if we move forward and think about, here's my pink and lime green shorts. I don't know if you can see that here. This is kind of my signature shorts back in the day when I was in high school. And I'm sure you can imagine how I might be perceived walking around in the hood with some pink and mint green plaid shorts. But let me kind of give a sense of what, kind of explicate cultural voyeurism. It describes the process by which mediated or indirect experiences provide a window into a culture of subculture that would otherwise be difficult for the voyeur to observe or access. It's a deliberate, recurrent, and proactive effort to acquire information about another culture or cultural phenomenon, sometimes from a distance through television and social media, sometimes as a participant observer experiencing it directly. So the voyeuristic process is driven by an individual's interest in, fascination about, and or identification with another culture or subculture to which he or she may not normally have easy access. And it's often facilitated through a media-enabled lens. So that kind of gives you a little bit of background in terms of how I explicate this concept. And it initiates in part from a curiosity that is fostered from or facilitated by positive or negative group-based stereotypes, because people aspire to get connected, to pursue, to immerse themselves in another culture, in part because of stereotypes or thoughts that they have about that culture. So it's oftentimes sparked by stereotypes. So people deliberately choose certain cultures or members from certain cultural groups to follow because these outgroup members have been stereotypically characterized as possessing specific traits and attributes that are often perceived as desirable, intriguing, or even novel. And a couple of factors that drive this cultural voyeurism, if you will, is the need to engage in self-expansion, which is to improve oneself. There's also a desire to distinguish yourself from others, even within your group. That's this notion of personal distinctiveness. And there's also this idea of you identify with a subgroup or cultural group. You aspire to be part of that group, and maybe it's a reference group. And sometimes it's as simple as desiring to be cool. So those are some of the things that lead us into engaging in cultural voyeurism. So today's discussion will primarily focus on how cultural voyeurism explains young white millennials' interest in and fascination with Black culture. So if we look at the history of Black culture, it's oftentimes have been the object of voyeurism, particularly by whites. As early as the 1920s, whites have observed and followed the works of Black artists, writers, musicians, and poets to learn more about the traditions and heritage of Black people. Here's an example of, for example, a white female who lives right outside of Iowa in Moline, Illinois, who actually has kind of a cultural, who displays cultural voyeurism as she engages in listening to hip hop music to learn more about Black culture. And I'll play you this clip real quick. You hear it?
Don't hear anything. Kind of.
Oh, you can. Oh, you can't hear it. That's okay. The white female talks about how she listens to hip hop music to learn more about Black culture, particularly since she's unlikely to be able to see it in person directly, and she uses it kind of voyeuristically to gain information and to educate herself about the culture and immerse herself in the culture. So we see that in many ways when it comes down to many white millennials who engage in Black culture, whether they're wearing the fashion labels, whether they're using the Black slang or listening to Black music, or even listening to or eating at soul food restaurants. I have a picture of some collard greens and mac and cheese and black eyed peas, yams, and cornbread to show you an example of soul food. Many whites are going to soul food restaurants, and it's not just eating, but they're immersing themselves in the culture. And unfortunately, I haven't eaten dinner, so just looking at that picture has actually made me a little bit hungry, especially from my mom's cooking, who she's very good cooking soul food. But so whites may express a connection with Black culture through their sayings and their gestures, through engaging in listening to music, and again, wearing clothing and using Black indigenous language, slang, if you will. So for today's conversation, what I want you to keep in mind is that, one, how is it that whites and Blacks respond to ethnic specific, race specific characters and media vis-a-vis characters and media that are not specific to their race. We would expect, for example, Blacks to respond very favorably to Black specific media and characters, but how do you expect whites to respond to Black character media and Black characters in general? There's a perception historically that whites wouldn't respond very favorably to ads and media that feature Black characters. So there was a reluctance to use Blacks in advertising, Blacks in media, particularly when those characters, when whites were viewing the media, so they would tend to avoid using Blacks to reach white consumers. So what my research shows is whites generally demonstrate no racial in-group favoritism when evaluating comparable white and Black characters, and in some cases, whites display an out-group preference for Blacks. So there's a growing body of work that has investigated how white audiences respond to ethnic-specific media and characters. Studies in a variety of contexts clearly show that ethnic media and characters have seemed to be attractive to white audiences, particularly millennials. And although I'm not a designer, I don't have that computer science background, what the research tells us is that scholars demonstrate that many of the best learning experiences come when individuals are engaged in designing and creating things. And for me, I took a lot of pleasure in designing and creating my methodology, particularly the stimuli that I used to examine this notion of cultural voyeurism. I'm a quantitative scholar, so I took a lot of pleasure in designing my stimuli using different techniques, and I'll show you some of those right now. So first, I conducted a study among high school students, Black and white high school students at several schools in Southern California and Northern California. And what I did is I had these print ads that I digitally manipulated from a few different brands. One of those brands in particular was a Cheerios cereal print ad. Here's an example of the Honey Nut Cheerios ad that I used in my study to kind of understand how Blacks and whites respond to ads featuring white and Black characters. In this particular study, what I was particularly interested in is finding out how whites and Blacks respond to ads featuring white and Black characters in ads, but I had my participants view one of two ads. One was either this ad here with the father and son in this Honey Nut Cheerios ad, or this one, which is I digitally manipulated the ad to show a Black father and son. And I showed participants either the Honey Nut Cheerios ad with the white characters or the Honey Nut Cheerios ad with the Black characters. And I was particularly interested in understanding, how they perceive themselves in terms of similarity, how much they identify with the characters, how much they believe the ad was targeted to them, and their overall attitudes towards the ads. And what I would ask you to take a second to think about, let's assume we all know how the Blacks responded, and that Blacks responded more favorably to Black character ads than they did the white character Honey Nut Cheerios ad. How do you think white participants, high school participants, responded to the white character versus the Black character Honey Nut Cheerios ad? Did they perceive themselves more similar to the white character vis-a-vis the Black character characters? Did they identify more with the Black characters or the white characters? Which one did they have more positive attitudes towards? So if you think about that, think about how you think they may respond. And I'll quickly tell you, what we see is, here are Blacks are the red line. So as we might have expected, Blacks perceive themselves more similar to the Black characters in the Honey Nut Cheerios ads than they did the white character in the Honey Nut Cheerios ad. But for whites, surprisingly, they didn't see themselves any differently. They perceived themselves just as similar to the Black characters as they did to the white characters. So perceived similarity was used to measure, their values and interests. Second, how closely did they identify with the characters? What we see here is, as we might expect, Black participants identified significantly more with the Black characters in the Honey Nut Cheerios ads than they did the white characters in the Honey Nut Cheerios ad. But whites identified more with the Black characters than the white characters. When you ask them, do they believe the ads were intended for them? But what we see here is that white participants were more likely to believe the ad was intended for them when they feature Black characters vis-a-vis white characters. And then when you get their overall perceptions of the ads, their attitude towards the ads, we see how Blacks responded. But whites were more likely to have more positive attitudes towards the Honey Nut Cheerios ad featuring Black characters than they did the one featuring white characters. And I hope I'm not going too quickly. And if you have some questions, I won't be able to see them right now because I have my chat on, but I'll be finished shortly and you can maybe share those questions with me afterwards. So what I see kind of going on here is that even though Blacks in these ads weren't stereotypically portrayed in terms of wearing maybe hip hop clothing or looking stereotypically Black, these characters were still, there were still enough cues there to give whites kind of an understanding of Black culture and Black people that led them to respond overall more favorably towards the Black characters in the Honey Nut Cheerios ad than the white characters in the Honey Nut Cheerios ad. And I think if we break it down, Blacks are oftentimes stereotypically characterized as setting the trends in a host of different areas, whether it's music, sports, fashion, language, and all of those areas are desirable among most people, particularly young people. And in an effort probably to feel either align themselves with the counterculture maybe, or to feel more cool and hip, they may connect more with Blacks and Black culture than whites and white culture. And again, we can talk about this a little bit more in a moment. So I wanted to see if this was consistent in other studies. So I conducted several other studies to see if this pattern remained. And I conducted another study where I had almost 300 undergraduate and graduate students at a large public Midwestern university. I wonder where that could be. I had roughly 60% males and 40% females. And in essence, what I had in this study is I digitally manipulated the Apple web page featuring the Macintosh PowerBook G4. And what I was particularly interested in to see if testimonial ads could play a role in impacting how whites and Blacks perceived a product and how if it made a difference in the recall of product information. And there had been some history where that Blacks weren't used. They were only used in low-end product ads or low-end brand or products or for food products and not for high-end luxury or products dealing with technology. So I said, I'll take technology. I'll look at the Apple G4 computer and see if I can use some testimonials from Blacks and whites and see how people responded. So let me just kind of show you what I did here. I took the this web page here from a few years ago of the PowerBook G4. And I used this as an example to have whites and Blacks either go to this page or they were assigned to this page here where I digitally manipulated the previous page and I added some testimonials from a few whites, Gentry Post and Janie Porsche here. And then I have a picture of a white person at the bottom to emphasize that this is kind of a white mainstream page. And these were testimonials from whites. And what they could do is they would click here. And when they click Gentry Post or Janie Porsche, what would happen is they would get a testimonial from them and they would read this testimonial and then they would read the testimonial from Janie Porsche, and then they would answer a series of questions. So participants were randomly assigned to either the page featuring no testimonials, the page featuring testimonials from whites, or a page featuring testimonials from Blacks. Here, Bill Swan, Teresa McPherson. So this was a page featuring Black characters. And when you clicked on the testimonial, it had the same story as there was for the white male in the previous one and the white female in the previous one as well. Also did a video version of this. Again, individuals were randomly assigned to one of the three conditions: no testimonials, testimonials with whites, or testimonials with Blacks. And the findings show, I'll show you what the findings demonstrate. Similarly to the other study, Blacks responded as we might expect, but whites identified more with the Black characters in the, identified more with the characters, the Black characters in their testimonials than they did the white characters in their testimonials, as you can see here from this blue line. If we look at their belief that the website was targeting them or meant for them, we see here with no testimonials, we see Blacks tended to believe the web page was targeting them or more intended for them when there were Black character testimonials than white character testimonials, which we would expect. But for whites, we could see that these are college students now who believe that the web page was targeting them more when it featured Black character testimonials than when it featured white character testimonials, or no testimonials at all. When we asked them their attitudes about the laptop, we see that there was some difference for Blacks, as we would expect, but also for whites. Whites had more favorable attitudes towards the G4 laptop when it featured Black character testimonials than white character testimonials. When we asked about recall of information, what we see here is that Blacks recalled more information from Black character testimonials than white character testimonials. And for whites, they recalled more information about the product when they listened to or read testimonials from Black characters than white characters. And we clearly see that they recall more information here from no testimonials in many cases. There's something called limited capacity model. I can talk about that later, but when we look at the characters, we can see that there's a difference based on race. So what do Blacks and whites? So that is an example of two studies. And I want to quickly go over another study, because what I demonstrated before is whites and Black participants being assigned a condition, being assigned a white character ad or a Black character ad. What if you allow them to choose information to view on their own? If you put them in a situation where, well, what if you measure the information unobtrusively? Here, there could be some social desirability things going on here. So I wanted to figure out, maybe let me see if I can measure their time on the website and see how much they might navigate on information from a Black character versus a white character. So I tried to do this unobtrusively by measuring their time on the site. Let me give you an example. I created two web pages or websites, one called Community in Motion, which is supposed to be a general market kind of mainstream web page, kind of news page from I created several years ago. And then individuals can click on one of these different categories. And I created another comparable one called Community in Motion, the Essence of Black America. So I put Black America because this gives them an impression that this is in essence targeted towards Black, it's Black media, a website maybe dealing with issues related to the Black community. And then if they click on one of these categories, let's say sports, they click on sports and a picture would pop up here. This is the mainstream, white mainstream page. Click on sports and a picture would come up featuring a white athlete. And here's the story about that white athlete. If you're on the Black web page, you click on the same sports category and a picture of a Black athlete would come up in the same story. So I randomly assign college students, white college students and Black college students to look at one of the or the other website and wanted to measure how much time they spent on each story and on each page. So what we see here in essence, white individuals sat down at a computer and they were told to navigate on the page like you normally would if you were browsing a website, and click on the different categories. And after a few minutes, after you've navigated as much as you want, you can just stop and the study will be over. So what we found is white web users, when they came across the white targeted website and the Black targeted website, they didn't spend any more time on the Black site compared to the white site. This is not statistically significant, even though it seems like they're spending more time on the Black targeted site. They didn't spend any more time on the stories. Their attitudes towards the site, the story, and recall of information was relatively no different statistically. for Blacks, there was a difference. So I show this to convey to you that even when you look at the information and you evaluate it unobtrusively, if you think about social desirability issues, there is no difference in their time on the site, whites that is, when it came down to overall time on the Black targeted site versus white targeted site. But it was for Blacks. And I had prematurely mentioned another study that I was doing, which deals with looking at what if you give participants the opportunity to select their own information. Okay, I'm going to forward to for this, in the spirit of time, I'm going to forward to a study that I designed to really look at selective exposure. When you get a newspaper and you look through the newspaper, there is information about Blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, everyone. There are positive stories, there are negative stories, there are stories about a lot of things. And you choose what information you want to read and select. Same thing in social media. I said newspaper, it tells you how old I am. If you look at social media and you're going on but not even social media, if you go on the web, go to CNN.com or wherever it is you go, you have the choice to choose whatever you want. So what if we do that with college students? So what I did is I had a number of college students, roughly, I think roughly 300. Half are Black, half are white. And I asked them to sit in a lab, go on a computer, and navigate through a news site that I created in one of my colleagues. Here's an example of the news site that we created called Worldwide News. And here we told students, hey, navigate this like you would normally any other website that you would, any other news site that you would go to. You know, click on things that are of interest to you. And after, we would tell them after about 10 or 15 minutes, the website will shut down and it will take you to some questions that will ask you about what you saw and read on this news site. Okay, hope I'm being clear. Now, these were the stories that they can click on. And these were the faces, the key characters that were associated with these stories. The way we designed it, these pictures were randomized. So sometimes this guy might be here where it says hospital chain selects new CEO. Sometimes this guy's picture might be down here where it says student overcomes learning disability. Sometimes this woman's picture might be here at high school principal, so it was randomized. These stories were randomized on the site as well. So different times they would click, the story, titles, and the pictures would be randomized. The other thing that I should mention, some of the stories were positively framed, some of the stories were negatively framed, both the stories and the titles, okay? With that in mind, we had students go on this site, and what we learned was, first and foremost, the pattern that we saw with how much time they spent on the stories was very similar to what we saw in the previous study. Whites spent just as much time on a story about Blacks as they did a story about whites, okay? But in this particular story, not only was it selective exposure, trying to figure out what they're giving them a chance to look at information on their own, we also were interested in, are they going to look at, more likely to look at positive information about their own group and negative information about their out group? What certain theories tell us, like social identity theory, if any of you folks are familiar with it, particularly my psychology folks, it tells us that we have an in-group bias where we tend to show favorability towards members within our own group. And when we come across information, we're much more likely to seek out information that is positive towards our own in-group. And when it comes to the out-group, oftentimes we engage in out-group derogation. We tend to think of out-groups more negatively. And we tend to seek out information about out-groups that is negative, in part that helps us feel better about ourselves. When the out group is doing negatively and we're doing positively, it helps raise our self-esteem and our self-worth. So there's a belief that Blacks would perceive, would seek out more positive information about their in-group and more negative information about whites. And just and for whites, they would do the same, seek out more positive information about whites and more negative information about Blacks. But I argued that I'm not sure if this is necessarily the case. So what our research shows us in this case is that when you look at Black news readers who were on this particular page, when they clicked on stories, they tended to do what social identity theory suggests, is they tended to seek out more positive information about Blacks. And the second thing that they looked at, the second most thing that they looked at was information about negative information about Blacks. So they seem to be more interested in getting information about Blacks, whether it was positive or negative, but particularly more positive. Then when they looked at information about whites, they were significantly more likely to seek out negative information about whites compared to positive information about whites. In contrast, whites, even though it appears they sought out more positive information about their in-group, which is consistent with social identity theory, than they did negative. So they sought out more positive information than they did negative information about themselves. But statistically, this is not statistically different. So they sought out just as much positive information about their out group as they did positive information about their own group. Okay. And when it came down to negative information, they were just as likely to look at negative information about whites as they were Blacks. So there is something here that seems to suggest that when you look at the literature, what we see here is Black selection of negative stories about Black characters may be driven by their need for surveillance. That's why they looked at both negative and positive information about Blacks, because they want to see what the world is saying about Blacks. But inconsistent with social identity theory is what we found with whites. There are some assumptions that whites perceive news information specifically about their own group as more interesting and valuable than news information about other racial groups. And we didn't find that. Future research should replicate this study with other ethnic minority groups, such as Asians. Also for other criteria of social groupings, like partisans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, have Republicans and Democrats recreate this study and have Republicans and Democrats come across information about Republicans and Democrats and see if they will respond similarly. So in conclusion, much of the popular press and communication research point to a bleak future of race relations. Cultural voyeurism and mediated interracial contact provide a more optimistic view. Scholars have demonstrated that prejudice and bias are generally reduced when people of different racial and ethnic groups interact. Cultural voyeurism facilitates meaningful mediated contact, which in turn helps promote positive interracial interaction. So the acquisition of knowledge derived from cultural voyeurism should aid cross-cultural understanding and contribute to the erosion of racial prejudice. Cultural voyeurism can lead to empathetic and identification or perspective taking, which allows individuals to identify with the vantage point of a person and experience the feelings, thoughts, and situations that person's improves. And lastly, we can facilitate out-group conversations when we talk about things like Black Lives Matter, when we talk about having a national conversation about race, and people tend to be very anxious and reluctant to do so. We can facilitate these out-group conversations even on sensitive racial issues like police brutality when we reduce perceptions of difference between in-group and out-group members and increase the perceptions of in-group, out-group similarity. Thank you for your time. These are some of the people who worked on this research with me. Really appreciate it. I'm going to take us off of share screen. And thanks for your patience.
Thank you for that. That was great. Super interesting.
My mind's all blown. Anyone want to start us off? I don't think I see any. Go for it.
Hi, thank you so much for presenting. This is a really important topic for me. I, like a lot of young people, I've been very influenced by hip hop culture, and in the past like 2 years, I've just been like continuously unpacking all of the problematics and complexities and positives and negatives to it. It's just a big, complicated thing. I wanted to ask you about experiences in which voyeurism gives so the representations of like ethnic experience in media are a small sliver of what it might mean to be part of a group. And something I really enjoyed about your presentation is that it highlighted the positive of cultural voyeurism, that it gives us opportunity to understand one another. But I've had experiences where it's mixed. Like, for example, I made friends with an international student a while ago. And when we first became friends, she used her experiences with Mexican American culture as like a bridge to try to understand me. And I really appreciated that, but it was also alienating and uncomfortable because I'm a middle-class mixed Filipino Central American kid from the desert in California. So the colors and the architecture and the food and the things that she associated with me and my body, they allowed her to connect to me more, but it also was painful to be understood in a way that I am not. And so I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how those two sides of voyeurism can be balanced?
Yeah, there's thanks very much for your question. I think there are a host of things that are going on here. One is depending on the information sources that he or she used, or any voyeur, the information sources that they use will oftentimes dictate their understanding of the group, whether it's the racial group or ethnic group. And if much of the information that they're getting is very much kind of one-sided, if it's not a great variance, if it's not a host of information that crosses the whole spectrum of a subculture or cultural group, then they can get a very biased frame of that information, either negative or positive. When it comes down to Blacks, oftentimes you get a lot of information from the news that tends to focus on negative issues associated with the Black community. But a voyeur, cultural voyeur, tends to immerse themselves in the culture, and they tend to access a host of different sources. And what we see today is that, unlike when I was young and growing up and having to rely on television or stuff in the movies, people can go to social media. They can go to Facebook and look at information that is being presented by, for example, Blacks, and do it unobtrusively. Even if you're not a friend, if you have some kind of link or connection, you can look at reality TV. You can go to Reddit and get information about different cultural groups and sit in and learn. But the problem becomes when, again, the information that they get is not a broad spectrum, because Blacks and Latinx and Asians, they are not monolithic. And sometimes the information that we may uncover as we begin to do our kind of voyeuristic immersion in the culture can appear to associate these groups as monolithic. And we have to understand that that's not the case. And the other thing that that comes to mind in terms of a possible negative aspect is the appropriation of the culture. Is this individual using their understanding of the culture to appropriate, to benefit from it in some way that where the way they're benefiting might be negative, where they're trying to steal the culture. So I am writing a manuscript on this topic, a book on this topic, and I'm talking about cultural voyeurism, but I coined this cultural Altruism. So as a person trying to steal the culture. But one thing that I find interesting is that typically the social psych research tells us that when people who are part of different cultural groups, when they interact directly, they tend to learn more about each other and develop more positive relationships and positive interactions, so that intergroup contact or contact theory. So what typically happens is when there may be this mediated contact that starts off initially through cultural voyeurism, and then it leads into more direct experience where that individual would have direct experiences with, let's say, a white person, they befriend a Black person. And through that contact, they develop great relationships and better understanding of each other. So that typically leads to better relationships. I guess on occasion, it could lead to misunderstanding if one comes in with, again, kind of one-sided view of the culture, given that they may perceive it as monolithic. I hope that helps at least that's my perspective on your question. Hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I appreciated you bringing up that the diversity of information that we encounter
Yes.
is important.
Yes.
Just a good point to have in my mind.
Any other questions that you may have?
Billy, you want to go for it?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Really interesting work. And thank you so much for being here and presenting your work. And I was just two small questions. One was, have you been able to recreate these findings in any other age groups outside of millennials? And then what years were these studies conducted?
Great question. I've only tried to recreate them among 14 to 30-year-olds, partly because I'm driven by the literature on millennials and Generation Z that tend to show that these groups seem to embrace diversity more so than baby boomers or traditionalists. I'm conducting a study right now looking at 18 to 65-year-olds, and I hope to uncover some information about whether some of these tendencies about being a cultural voyeur can be seen with older groups. And when we talk about these studies, they go from 2000 to, I think the most recent study I did on cultural voyeurism was 2016 or 2018.
Great. I look forward to seeing more of your work. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good question, actually, to follow up on that. How did you determine that they were cultural voyeurs? Were you like kind of like, were there surveys that kind of like helped determine that?
Well, that's another great question. The follow-up studies that I'm doing will do kind of a pre-test, post-test, where they'll try to get a better understanding of their general media habits, their perceptions of racial outgroups, and connecting that with their media patterns, their involvement in cultural events and ceremonies, to get a sense of kind of how they immerse themselves in the culture, that racial outgroup culture. So in this case, much of this is trying to connect the data and trying to understand what may be going on, and explaining why it is that whites and Blacks are responding the way they do to ethnic specific media and characters. So as a follow-up, I hope to, right after the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, I was starting to study to look at some of these ways to better explain cultural voyeurism more directly than doing it more implicitly. So that's a great question. I hope to be able to have more direct evidence of cultural voyeurism in the future.
Super cool. Any Any last question for anyone?
Do you know what has caused younger people to be more interested in cross-cultural experiences? And what is the
Great question.
generational divide?
Great question. Over the last 10, 15 years, we see that young people tend to, for example, live in communities that are more integrated. They tend to go to schools that are more integrated racially, religiously. They're growing up with folks who are maybe perceived as part of a stigmatized or marginalized group, and they're interacting with those folks more often than you might see 50 years ago, where schools were more segregated, communities were more segregated. We're seeing gentrification even in inner city communities where whites and blacks are spending a lot more time together, not just in terms of the workplace, but also socially. So a lot of this is happening with more, I would argue, integrated schools, more interracial relationships, friendships. And when you look at television and movies, we see more recently one of the most popular movies in the history, I think one of the top 5 movies ever, was Black Panther, a show that was primarily dominated with Black characters. So we're seeing a greater display of movies, television shows that feature either Black dominated casts that are popular among white audiences, and they get to learn about the culture more. And we see situations where Blacks are leads in shows, and it gives audience members a greater understanding of racial groups than what we've seen in the past. So I think it's a host of those things that I mentioned that's leading young people in particular to develop these friendships, this understanding that older groups like traditionalists may not have encountered.
Sign of hope. All right. Well, if there's any last question, speak up now. All right. Otherwise, thank you so much, Osei. That was.
I want to thank everyone for their patience and coming out tonight and listening to my presentation. And there are hundreds of places you could have been other than here, and I just really appreciate your willingness to listen, ask questions, and thanks for the opportunity. Wish you guys have a good evening, and hope to come across you again in the future at some conference or maybe even at UCSD.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Same to you. Have a great night.
Round of
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Edward. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.